All right, we'll say good morning, good morning. Beginning by thanking all of our sponsors. To begin, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Shvat. To thank Mrs. Bracha Shimmer for dedicating all of Shimmer Drushos this month in memory of Avram Ben Kalman Eliezer Halevi Zichron Lebracha. To thank Ayala and Sarah Steinberg for dedicating all of Shimmer Drushos this month in the Schus Refuah Shleima for Shulamis Bas Susha. And to thank our Daf Yomi sponsor for today, Dr. Gary Goodman, Silver Spring, for dedicating the Shir in honor of the Shir from Eretz Hashem, the continuing daily Talmud Torah. We will say with that, let us begin. We have a lot to do today. Baruch Hashem, a lot to do today. So we are picking up in Eretz Hashem. Today's daf is Chav Daled, but you would not know that from where we are beginning. So I'll say, but we are picking up in Eretz Hashem on Chav Gimel Amud Beis, and we are picking up in Eretz Hashem. Easier to count down from the top. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 13 lines down from the top. But it goes quickly. Says the Gemara. Amr Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. Both say incredible Gemara. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. Gidol la'aveir l'shma, mi mitzvah shelo l'shma. Such incredible. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says, an aveir l'shma. Both remember again, we spoke about this in yesterday's daf. What's an aveir l'shma? So both say again, it doesn't mean I do an aveira for the sake of doing an aveira because I enjoy it so much. Right? An aveir l'shma means the commission of an aveira for the sake of a mitzvah. So both say we've seen examples of this already before, right? The daughters of Lot are a paradigmatic example of this. It's now in Yomi de Yoma Esther. Esther Hamalka is an example ultimately of an Aveira Lishma. So you have now, again, don't try this at home, because first of all, Tosas brings down by Esther Hamalka that the concept of Aveira Lishma is often a concept that could only be employed for Hatzalas Yisrael. In other words, can you imagine? A person says, today, I'm going to do this. I think that this is the best, right? I think that mamish, this is the Ratzon Abore, that I go ahead and do this because by the way, we're good like this. You could construct a pretty compelling argument why you need to do a particular Avera for a good reason. That's why Tosafos seems to say that no. This is a din when there's an existential threat to Klal Yisrael. And therefore, again, you need to engage in an action which would otherwise be prohibited for the sake of Hatzalas Yisrael. And again, if you see, that's the theme. Okay, the daughters of Lot is not Hatzalas Yisrael, it's Hatzalas, or they think Hatzalas humanity, right? Esther Hamalka is Hatzalas Yisrael. So at the end of the day, there is this concept of an Aveira Lishma. But the Gemara says, Gidol Aveira Lishma, mi mitzvah shelo Lishma. It will say, so incredible. An Aveira Lishma is better than a mitzvah shelo Lishma. But I will say, I just want to point out something. We're going to disprove this statement in just a moment. But I will say, but didn't say the profundity of a statement like that. An Aveira Lishma is better than a mitzvah shelo Lishma. What's a mitzvah shelo Lishma? What's mitzvah shelo Lishma? Right? Just the mitzvah that you do without what? Without thinking. I must say, I would venture to say that a lot of times our mitzvahs are shelo Lishma. Just again, I'm not thinking about it. I must say, do you hear what the statement that Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak is saying? That the most important life is to have thing in life is to have kavana, kivun, direction, right? To have thoughts, to be passionate about something, to be directed about something. Don't just coast through life. Don't just go. Don't just move. Don't just put on the autopilot. It is so much better. What he seems to be saying is it's so much better to do a targeted avera for the sake of some good than just to do amorphous mitzvos with absolutely not thinking about anything. Now, like I said, we're going to disprove this statement in just a moment, but the fact that it's even on paper, right? The fact that it's even eternal because it's included in Shas is such an incredible idea. Rachmana liba boy. What HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants at the end of the day is, come on, put passion into it, put excitement into it. Whatever you're going to do, commit yourself to it. Be involved. Don't coast through life. It's so easy. And most of us do it over 120 years. You could set cruise control, right? Started at birth, ended at the grave. By the way, the great part about that cruise control is it'll get you from point A to point B. It will get you from cradle to the grave. That's the way it works. But Lamaisa, you miss out on leading and living an impactful life all the way through. Such an incredible yisod. So the Gemara goes weiter. The Gemara says, but 1 second. Was that Amarav? Is that true? V'amarav Yehuda Amarav li'olim yasok ad b'torah mitzvos afilu shelo lishman. Once we have a principle. What's the principle? Better for a person to learn Torah shelo lishma, right? Than not to go ahead, not to do it at all. Shemitoch Shalol Lishman, Balishman. Both say, again, so it seems to be that Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak is really knocking a mitzvah Shalol Lishma. But one second, says the Gemara, okay, everyone will agree that a mitzvah Shalol Lishma, right? A mitzvah without kavanah, a mitzvah not for a directed purpose. It's not great. But it's certainly not in the same category as an Aveira, right? At the end of the day, halacha l'maisa, Shalol Lishma is good. Why? Because ultimately, Shalol Lishma, Balishma. I was going to say, this is also an incredible idea, which is, as much as we speak about kavanah, leading a targeted life, the most important thing to do is do. Don't wait for the right kavanas in order to engage in dynamic activity. Do what you need to do. Do what needs to be done. But it's without kavanah, it's without feeling, it's without this. Fine. Do engage. Also, we spoke about this. That ultimately the way I feel and the way that I think is often shaped by the way that I act. So sometimes in life you have to engage in activity shalol lishma. That's the way it works. But the good news is, with enough behavioral habit, ultimately again the lishma, the kavana will emerge Hashem come. So how can you say that an avera lishma is greater than a mitzvah shalol lishma? That seems to be a bit dramatic. Ella. Ema ki mitzvah shalol lishma. Rather, I will say what it means is like this: that at the end of the day, an avera lishma is equivalent to a mitzvah shalol lishma. Okay, so that's an interesting equation, right? An avera lishma, an avera that is done for the sake of a mitzvah, ultimately again is, so to speak, I guess hashkafically equivalent to a mitzvah shalol lishma, to a mitzvah that's done without the right kavanah. The pasuk says. Now I will say. So the idea, the takeaway from this is that at the end of the day, an avera lishma is like a mitzvah. Now, what kind of mitzvah is it like? Is it like a mitzvah shalol lishma? Is it greater than a mitzvah shalol lishma? So that we see is subject to some level of dispute. The Gemara is going to prove this idea now, that an avera lishma is as great as a mitzvah. So watch this. The Gemara says, Dichsiv, Tivorach minashim yoel, eishas chivra akeni, minashim ba'ohel tivorach. So I'll say the pasuk says over here in Shoftim. Remember again, so Yael killed Sisra. She killed Sisra, right? We know again this is the Haftorah on Rosh Hashanah. Vatiyavev aim Sisra. Actually, the Gemara Maseches Rosh Hashanah learns out many of the halachos of the concept of a trua, the trua being a yevava, right? Ultimately, again, so that's how we translate trua as a yevava. What's a yevava? Vatiyavev aim Sisra. So here, Devora, the Shofetes, and the Neviah is extolling Yael. And it says, Yael, Tevorach Yael Minashim, Yael Eshes Chever HaKeni. So amongst all women, Yael, the wife of Chever HaKeni, should be blessed. Minashim ba'ohel. She's even blessed from amongst the women of the tent. Who are the women of the tent? Man nashim ba'ohel, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Veleah. Wow. So Devora praises Yael, and she says that Yael, you have a place in Klal Yisrael amongst the women of the tent. Right? Who are the women of the tent? The imos. So she compares Yael to the imos. Now, both say, now watch this. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Sheva bi'ilos ba'al osara sheba osasha. When Sisra hid in Yael's tent, she had relations with him 7 times. 7 times. Shene Emar, Bein Ragleha Kara Nafal Shachav. So we'll say, so what do you see from here? Now this was an Avera Lishma. So we'll say, so the idea over here is that Gemara learns out from the verbs employed in the pasuk, that ultimately, again, each of them is a reference to an act of relations. Why did Yael have relations with Sisra 7 times? Ultimately, so that he would be exhausted, that he would be fatigued, and once he was sleeping, that's when she killed him. She drove a peg into his head, thereby cementing the victory of Klal Yisrael. But she had relations with him. So I'll say, so what do you see from here? We call this act of relations an Avera Lishma. She did it for Atzalas Yisrael, and therefore, again, when she is praised amongst, together with the Imos. I have a hakamis hanya maybe ilo delay. But 1 second, I will say, in this case, even if you want to claim that it was an Avera Lishma, didn't she have pleasure from the act of relations? In other words, she initiated the act of relations with him. It's not like Chas V'Shalom that he abused her, took advantage of her. She initiated. So didn't she have pleasure from this act as well? And wouldn't that make it a more severe act? Rabbi Yochanan kol tovasan sharishayim eina ela ra itzal tzadikim. Was a very profound idea. The Gemara says, any tova, any good of the tzaddikim, of the Rishayim, is in other words, any benefit that comes from Rishayim is always considered to be something negative for tzaddikim. Shnei Amar, Hishamar lecha midaber al Yaakov, mim Yaakov mitov yadra. Because Baruch Hu tells Lavan, when Lavan is chasing after Yaakov, be careful, Lavan, do not speak with Yaakov anything good or anything bad. Bishlamara, I understand why Lavan can't say something bad to Yaakov Shapri. That makes sense. Elotov amaylo. Why can't Lavan say something nice to Yaakov? Elalav shmaminot tovaso ra'a. He rather, what do you see from here? You see that even the good of the Rasha is considered to be something negative by the tzaddikim. Indeed, shmamina. Indeed, Rabbi say ultimately again see that this is the case. Rabbi say so. Therefore, the Gemara leaves off. I just will point out, we don't have time to get into it today, but Tosas V'Ham Mishanya actually makes reference to Esther Hamalka as well in the context of this discussion. Maybe if we have a little bit of time left over today, then because today's daf is a little bit shorter, then Amir Hashem will come back and why is everybody smiling when I say that? Stop it. And so I'll say, so then Amir Hashem will come back and we'll take a look at it. So I'll say, so again, what I want to point out, and this closes out the sugya over here of Avera Lishma. So we'll say very profound idea. And of course, what's the takeaway message for us of an Avera Lishma? Think about it just a moment, right? So the Gemara tells us that Avera Lishma essentially is like a mitzvah. All right, is it as great as a mitzvah shalol lishma, greater than a mitzvah shalol lishma? Let's say so. For me and you, right? So you and I, we're not committing averos lishma. That's not what we're doing. So what do I take from a Gemara like this? So I think what we take is that sometimes in our avodas Hashem, we have to do things which are uncomfortable for us, which sometimes growth in life requires you to leave your comfort zone. The truth is, the first person who taught us this was Yaakov Avinu, right? Yaakov Avinu, in order to receive the brachos from his father, which were rightfully his, had to do something that he was incredibly uncomfortable with. Right now, granted, in Yaakov Avinu's case, it was his mother who was telling him what he had to do. But Lamaisa, sometimes growth requires me to do things with which I am uncomfortable. And I don't mean uncomfortable like illegal or uncomfortable illicit, but often, again, accomplishment of great things in life requires me. It would be wonderful to always live in your comfort zone. We all have that, right? We all have that sweet spot in life. We're like, I'm comfortable doing this. I'm comfortable living like this. I'm comfortable accomplishing like this. And sometimes in life, in order to do something great, you have to leave that comfort zone. Sometimes the Avera Lishma means pushing yourself into an area of discomfort because you know that this is necessary for your complete self-actualization. That's the Musar Haskil of an Avera Lishma. Rabbi says, Gufa, Amar Rabbi Hudam Rav, the Olam Yasok, Adam Batar Mitzos, Afilu Sholashman. Rabbi said, by the way, is incredible. So a person should go ahead and learn Torah Shlosh. This is what we just quoted before. We just quoted before. Ideally, a person should go ahead and learn Torah. Now, I will say, Yasok B'Torah Mitzvos means learn Torah, engage in mitzvos, afilu shelo lishman, even not for the right reasons. In other words, we'll say, what's the right reason to learn Torah? What's the right reason to do mitzvos? Because ultimately, again, I want to create a relationship with Hashem. But the truth is, we often learn Torah and mitzvos and do mitzvos for all kinds of reasons. I want schar, I want reward, like we saw in the Ramchal. I want to avoid punishment. Maybe even I want kavod, right? All different kinds of things. And the Gemara says, okay, that's all right. Better to do the right thing. Here's the klal. Better to do the right thing for the wrong reason than not to do the right thing at all. That's better to go ahead. So So better to do the right thing for the wrong reasons. Because once you're habituated, once you're the kind of person who does the right thing, ultimately what? The right reasons and the right kavanas will come. So the Gemara says, listen to this. This is crazy. Because of the 42 karbanos that Balak offered up to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Yatzat Mimenu Rus. I will say, listen to how wild this is. Balak, the king of Moab, offered up 42 karbanos. I will say, why did Balak, the king of Moab, offer up 42 karbanos to Hashem? Why? Because he wanted to curse Klal Yisrael. Remember again, this is the story with Bilam, right? He offered up 42 karbanos because he was setting the stage to curse Klal Yisrael by getting HaKadosh Baruch Hu to agree to curse Klal Yisrael. So Balak didn't offer up karbanos for the right reasons. He offered up karbanos for all the wrong reasons. Yet, Rabosai, because of that sacrificial act of Balak, he was zocha to have a granddaughter. And who was that granddaughter? Rus. Rus. And I will say, who is Rus? Rus is essentially the mother of the Messianic line. I will say, isn't that incredible to think about? The mother of the Messianic line comes from a mitzvah shalol l'shma. I will say, by the way, it's even worse than a mitzvah shalol l'shma, right? What Balak did is not having a mitzvah shalol l'shma. What is it? It's like, I don't even know what you call it. He was trying to curse Klal Yisrael. But at the end of the day, he did something good. He offered up karbanos to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So the mother of the Messianic line comes from what we'll call a mitzvah shalol l'shma, which I will say just tells you the power of our mitzvahs. We don't even recognize the power we have on a daily basis to affect change. Each and every day, everything we do, big and small, generates so many dramatic positive ripple effects. I will say, not true, not true. Balak essentially births the Messianic line through a mitzvah shalol l'shma. It's incredible. It's incredible. So the Gemara says, Rus, and Rabbi Yossi Rechanina says that Rus was the granddaughter of Eglon, the king of Moab. Now we'll say, now what does that have to do with anything? Because at the end of the day, Eglon was also the one when he heard about when somebody came to him in the name, the Navi came to him in the name of Hashem. So Eglon stood up. He stood up. So he demonstrated kavod to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The fact that he demonstrated kavod to HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave him a granddaughter. So we'll say, who does Rus? Rus has a pretty impressive Moabite pedigree, right? In other words, from Eglon, from Balak, she is descendant of royalty, Gentile royalty, but royalty nevertheless. And halacha l'maisa, the reason why her ancestors were privileged to birth a woman like her was because of their mitzvot shalol l'shma. Incredible. So I will say, how do we know that HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't withhold reward even for the smallest of positive acts? Small positive acts. I will say, even the positive act of just proper speech. How do I know that even for sicha noah, for positive, nice speech, HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't withhold reward? Dilu bechira dekarise Moav amli rachmana al tatzer es Moav val tiskar bam melchama hu dalo aval sauri sarina. I will say, so remember, back to Lot and his daughters. The oldest daughter names her son Moav. What's the meaning of Moav? Pretty self-explanatory. Me'av. This is from my father. Now I will say, that's pretty intense, right? Pretty intense to wear that on your sleeve, right? And to identify your child as the offspring of an act of incest. So the Gemara says, because there was a certain lack, because it was a profound lack of refinement, therefore, although Klal Yisrael is not permitted to go to war with Moab, we are permitted to go ahead and be a bit aggressive with Moab. Vilut Seira, Dikarise Ben Ami. Yet I will say, the younger daughter, what does she name her son? She names her son Ammon. Now I will say, Ammon is a contraction of Ben Ami, the son of my nation, a much more veiled reference to the paternity of her child, much more tsanua, much more modest, and much more refined. As a result, the Torah says, Amrle al titzureim val tiskarbam afilu tsauri lo titzarinan klal. When it comes to Ammon, Rabbi, say, not only can we not do battle with them, but what? We can't go ahead and be aggressive with them as well. So I'll say, so why does Klal Yisrael have to exhibit kinder treatment to Ammon than to Moab? It's ultimately a reward to the younger sister for using a more refined speech when naming her child than her older sister did. So the point I will say is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu does not withhold reward for anything. And I will say, by the way, I just want to point out, it's incredible because this is like the opposite end. We learned in the Ramchal, Yira Sachet, about that there's an onesh, there's a punishment for every single negative thing that we do. So on the flip side, on the positive side, there's also schar. There's also reward for every single positive thing that we do, even the slightest of the slightest. There's always going to be schar, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu never withholds that schar. Even the daughters of Lot, the younger one gets greater schar than the older one because she chose to exhibit refined speech. Incredible. The Olam was incredible. Yaktim Adam Lidvar Mitzvah. So we'll say this is wild. So a person should always run to do a mitzvah. Yaktim Adam Lidvar Mitzvah means, I will say, don't walk lethargically or tiredly or slowly to do a mitzvah. Yaktim means go quickly. Zrizos to do a mitzvah. Why? I will say it's interesting because beforehand, what we just did is we just said that the older daughter of Lot lacked a certain refinement and modesty in the way, as manifest in the way that she named her child, Moav. She broadcasted to the world, this kid is from my father. Yet, Chazal see that the older daughter was greater than the younger one in one respect, which was that the older daughter acted first. She acted first. In the schus of the fact, the fact that the older daughter acted before the younger daughter, top of Chav Dalid, Zachsa v'kadma arba'a doros b'Yisrael malchus. The offspring of the older daughter produced Jewish monarchy 4 generations earlier than the offspring of the younger daughter. So we'll see, if you look at Rashi, Rashi says, over top Rashi Chaptal Ramadalif, Rashi says, Oved Yishai David Shlomo. V'ilu tzira la'asa b'Yisrael ad rechavam tahava mina'ama ha'amonis. So I will say, ultimately, again, the older daughter ultimately, again, is responsible for Rus, who ultimately has Oved Yishai David Shlomo, 4 generations of Malchus. The younger daughter, generations later, has a granddaughter by the name of Naama Ha'amonis. Naama Ha'amonis marries Shlomo HaMelech, and together they have a son, Rechavam, who inherits the monarchy from Shlomo. Unfortunately, it's under Rechavam that the kingdom splits, but ultimately, again, what does the Gemara attribute the fact that monarchy came from the older daughter earlier in the schus of her zrizos? And the schus of her zrizos. So it's just incredible, by the way, how we're learning all of these halachas from an act of incest. Right? All of these concepts. So in other words, again, it was an avera l'shma, but you see how the older daughter ultimately, again, was determined to do what she thought needed to get done in what she perceived to be these dire circumstances. And in the schus of her zrizos, ultimately, again, she is zocheh to produce 4 generations of monarchy earlier than her younger sister. We'll just point out how fascinating it is that now, kind of, when you look at the story of Jewish monarchy, so we'll say, look where monarchy comes from. Where does it come from? On one side of the equation, it comes from Tamar and Yehuda, right? Tamar and Yehuda. And on the other side, who does it come from? Right? So Lot and his daughters. It's just absolutely fascinating. And again, I quoted this earlier. The Maral brings down that it's by design. It's by design because stories like this allow the monarchy to remain humble. Right? The whole danger of monarchy is gaiva. The fact that monarchy comes from these types of origins allows the monarch ultimately again to remain humble despite all of his monarchical accomplishments. That ends the Agarata. Not ends, pauses the Agarata for now. But say Mishnah. Ha'isha shenadra ben Nazir ve'afrisha behemta. Suppose we've actually seen this case already. A really fascinating case. Here we go. So Ha'isha shenadra ben Nazir. So a woman took on Ned and Nazir. So I'll say, here we go. So same case. Rachel's married to Ruvain. Rachel becomes a Nazira. Ve'afrisha as behemta. So what did Rachel do? Rachel's preparing for the concluding sacrifices. Now I will say, remember again, we'll get into more specificity, but we know that at the conclusion of a Neder Nazirus, the Nazir is offering a chatos, an olah, and the shlamim. We're also going to see there's a whole bunch of loaves of bread that are also offered as part of the concluding rituals, sacrificial ritual. We'll get to that. So here's the case. Bless you. Rachel became a Nazira. What did she do in preparation for the conclusion of her Neder Nazirus? She separates out her animals, right, ready to bring her kabaros. Now what happened? So we'll say after she separated out the animals, what happened? Her husband heard about the Neder Nazirus. What does Ruvain do on the day that he hears about the Neder Nazirus? He's made for it. Fine. No, that's fine. That's his right. What's going to be the shaila? What do we do with the animals? What do we do with the animals which have been designated ultimately as kamos? So we had this. We quoted this Mishnah 2 days ago. So what's the halacha? Im shalo haisa behema teitze v'tira be'eder. So halacha l'maisa. If the animal belonged to the husband, in other words, if it's the husband's animal, no problem. It just goes back to the flock. I will say so again. Teitze v'tira be'eder means it's returned to the flock and can graze as usual. That's it. In other words, no sanctity attached to the animal. But however, if the behemoth is hers, we'll discuss exactly what it means the behemoth is hers. Hachatos tamus, the chatos animal, has to be left to die. Va'ola tikrav ola, the ola animal should be offered up as an ola, as in the dava. Right? Shlamim, tikrav shlamim, the shlamim animal should be offered up as a shlamim, also on a dava. V'nechamim liyom echad, they can be eaten for 1 day. And I will say eaten for 1 day, that's the normal window for the karbanos of a Nazir. Ve'enon tu'unin lechem. But I will say there are no accompanying loaves that are brought. So we'll discuss, again, we haven't discussed this at all, but there are loaves that are brought together with the concluding karbanos of a Nazir. But you don't bring the loaves. So we'll say, now, Asavis, why don't I bring the loaves? Why don't I bring the loaves? Why not? Because are these karbanos of a Nazir that are being offered up? No. What's being offered up over here? Nidavos. Nidavos. Therefore, the Gemara says, so we'll say, so again, let's pause here for just a moment. Let's review the case. Rachel said, Hareini Nazira. No problem. She's going through her Neder Nazirus. Her husband doesn't know. Obviously, they're not a couple that shares everything. Right? So, right, husband doesn't know. So what does she do? Now she's coming to the end. She separates out her karbanos. 3 animals. Chatos, Ola, Shlamim. Reuven finds out. Reuven says, nope, not going to have it. Annuls the neder. Now the shaila is, what do we do with the animals? So the Mishnah says, it depends. What does it depend on? If they're his animals that she used, no problem. No sanctity there. Put them right back with the rest of the flock, no problem. If they're her animals, then they do have sanctity. So what do I do? Then the chatos left to die. We'll talk about that. Chatos left to die. The ola is offered up as an ola. But I will say, what type of ola? An adava. Remember again, anyone could come to the Beis HaMikdash and offer up a carbon adava, a voluntary offering of an ola. So we'll offer up this ola as a voluntary offering. Shlamim, same thing. We'll offer it up as an adava, a voluntary offering. However, there are no accompanying loaves, which of course, again, because it's not the carbon of a Nazir, it's just an adava. Okay, fine. What happened if hayula mos? So we'll say, what happens if instead of separating out animals, what did she do? She set aside money. She set aside money for the purchase of karbanos. So now again, we'll say, same case. Rachel said Hareini Nazira, right? So she separated out money for the concluding karbanos. Her husband hears about her neder, and what does he do? He annuls it. So now the shaila is, what do we do with the money? So watch this. So hayilamos stumin yiplu l'nedava. So we'll say, if halacha l'maisa, if all she had was like a pile of money, right? If all she had was just an unspecified pile of money. In other words, there was a pile of money, but it wasn't that like, $100 is for the ola, and $632, right? $100 is for the ola, right? All right, $100 is for the shlamim, or this. It wasn't like any of that. In other words, she just had a pile of money in it, and that's it. So, but it wasn't defined. Then ultimately, yiplu nadava, that entire pile of money, could be used to purchase karbanos nadava, voluntary offerings. Ma'os mifurashin. I will say, however, what happens in the pile of money if she had identified, X amount of money for a chatos, X amount of money for an ola, X amount of money for a shlam. In that case, I will say, what do we do? When it comes to the chatos money, yelchu liyam hamelach. When it comes to the chatas money, what does she do? She takes it and she throws it into the Dead Sea. So we'll say, this is the theme we have over and over again, that by a chatas, we'll see, okay, we'll see. Chatas, she takes the money, throws it into the Dead Sea, lo nanin v'lo mo'alin behind. So you can't get any hana from that money, but if you did get hana from that money, you are not in violation of mi'ilah. Remember again, what's mi'ilah? Mi'ilah is mundane use of consecrated items. The me'ola, what do you do with the ola money? Yaviu ola. Ultimately, again, I will say you should use the ola money to purchase an ola for a nedava. And ultimately, again, if you do misuse that money, you are subject to me'ilah. To me shlamim, we will say, what do you do with the shlamim money? Yaviu shlamim. Ultimately, use the money to purchase a shlamim. And I will say all these karbanos are consumed for one day, and there's absolutely no need to bring the loaves of bread for the karban. Good. So we'll say that's our Mishnah. Let's analyze this a little bit. Mantana de balo mishtabla. So we'll say, so let's start with case number 1. Case number 1 is where Rachel said Hareini Nazira, and I will say, okay, she's going through her Neder Naziros. Then what's step 2? That's step 1. What's step 2? Step 2, she separated out animals for her karbanos. I will say, now in this case, she used her husband's animals for karbanos. Step 3, what happens? Husband hears about it. What does he do? He annuls the neder. He's made for it. So I will say, so now the Mishnah says, so what's the status of the animals? Chulin. They just go back to the herd, and that's it. There's nothing more to talk about. So I will say, so this sparks a very interesting discussion, which is the fact that if she uses his animals seems to indicate to us that a husband has absolutely no obligation to provide for his wife's sacrificial needs. So who is the Tana that holds that a husband is not obligated to furnish his wife with any necessary karbanos? So I will say, take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Man Tana delo mishabedlo. Sorry, who is the Tana who holds that he's not responsible for her karbanos? So man hu Tana ditani dekasavar shem haisa behemesh shalo lo chayel alei kedusha klal. Because we'll say the whole idea of the Mishnah is that if she uses his animal, no sacrificial kedusha devolves upon that animal. Damar teitze v'tira be'eder mishum dabal lo mishabedla lahavi karbanos klal v'chi mafrishe hi the nazirus hari kimoshe makdish davar she'eno shalo de'ein b'dvarav klum. So we'll say, now watch this. The way the Gemara is saying in the Mishnah is the following way: that when a woman comes along and she's a Nazira, and she separates out his karbanos, his animals for a karban, and then he says he's made for her neder. So I will say, essentially, there's no sanctity upon those animals. Why is no sanctity upon those animals? Because ultimately, she was makdish something which does not belong to her. Well, so in other words, if I go over to you, right, and I take your watch, and I say, you know what, I'm feeling very frum today. I'm going to be makdish your watch to the Beis HaMikdash. What's the status? I will say, you can't do that. Ein adam makdish davar she'eno shalo. You cannot be makdish something that is not yours. So I will say, who is the Tana who holds that essentially a wife doesn't have the ability to be makdish her husband's property, which is another way of saying a husband has absolutely no obligation to provide his wife with her sacrificial needs. Who is that Tana? Amrav Chisda Rabbanan. It's Rabbanan. They say that Rabbi Huda, because if you think it would be Rabbi Huda, why would, just because he annuls the neder, the animal should still retain its sanctity? Why? Hamish Shabbatlah. Because what Rabbi Huda holds, it's very interesting, we're going to see this. Rabbi Huda holds that halacha l'maisa, a husband is obligated to provide for his wife's sacrificial needs. So also here it is, Disanya. This is incredible. Disanya, Rabbi Huda Omer, Adam maybe karban ashral ishto. V'chein karban osah shi chayeves. Shabbos, listen to this. Rabbi Huda holds that in general, halacha l'maisa, if a married woman has to bring a karban, so we'll say there are certain karbanos which depend on your financial health or your financial state, right? If you're wealthy, if you're poor, the halacha is even if the wife herself doesn't have money, but the husband does have money, a husband is obligated to provide a rich man's karban for his wife's sacrificial needs. Not only that, says Rabbi Huda, but what else? So the Gemara says, and I will say, anytime a wife becomes chayeves to bring a karban in the course of marriage, a husband is obligated to supply that karban. So I will say, according to Rabbi Huda, this is a Tanai Ksuva. Fascinating. This is one of the conditions of the ksuva, that Allah said that a husband agrees to provide his wife with all of her sacrificial needs. But isn't that incredible? It's a Tanai ksuva. It was actually written into the ksuva. Any obligations that you have, I hereby take upon myself. So Rabbi Huda holds that a husband is obligated to take care of his wife's sacrificial needs. So Rava Amar, so we'll say the Rabbanan on the other hand hold, not true. Not true. It's not a Tanai ksuva. A husband has no such obligation. So I will say it would appear that the author of our Mishnah, who holds that once the husband is made for her neder, if she had set aside the husband's animals, that those animals go back to becoming chulin, that sounds like the position of the Rabbanon, who hold that a husband has no obligation to take care of his wife's sacrificial needs. Rav says, not necessarily. I feel it Rabbi Yehuda, Kim Rabbi Yehuda. But it's even correct Rabbi Yehuda, Kim Shabbat la, b'milsa detzricha la. Low. I would say, no, it's even Rabbi Huda. What does Rabbi Huda hold? That a husband is obligated to take care of his wife's sacrificial needs when she's liable to something. Rabbi say, in this case, in the Mishnah, is she liable to anything? No. Why not? He annulled her neder. So I say, in other words, it could even be Rabbi Huda. Even Rabbi Huda holds halacha l'maisa. The only time he's obligated is mamish when she is obligated. But here, she's not obligated because he was made for the neder. Ikadam was an alternate version of this. Alternate version. Ikadam Amri Man Tana. Who is the Tana of our Mishnah? Amrav Chisda Rabbi Huda. It's Rabbi Huda. V'chi meshabed la b'milsa detzricha la b'milsa delot tzricha la lo. But even Rabbi Huda holds that when is a husband obligated to provide for his wife's sacrificial needs? Only when she's actually obligated in a karban. But in this case, he was made for the neder. Therefore, what? She is not obligated in a karban. The Rabbanan. Because if it was Rabbanan, lo mishabed lo klal. Ultimately, again, he's not obligated to her at all. So I will say, so just as an aside, a fascinating machlokes, is a husband obligated, as part of Tanai Ksuva, is a husband obligated to provide his wife with her karbanos over the course of the marriage? Machlokes Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbanan. Rabbi Yehuda says yes, Rabbanan say no. So who's the author of our Mishnah? We've established this. Anyone could be the author of our Mishnah. Because in our Mishnah, at the end of the day, the reason why, if she designated his animals, they go back to Chulin, is because there's no obligation. Why is there no obligation? Why is there no obligation? Because he annulled her neder. So therefore, there's no sacrifice. So everyone will agree that Allah in that case, his animals go back to being regular Chulin animals. I asked the Gemara, so let me ask you this. So I will say, what would be a case? What would be a case where he would be obligated? So kigon the akni law. So we'll say a case could be, for example, where he went ahead and he conferred ownership. He was makne an animal to her, nakne to her. Kigon the akni law, the kevan the akni law hava dinafsha. And once he's makne to her, it becomes her animal herself, right? It's her own animal. Amud Bezer will say, Rava says, afilu temer rabbanon. Ki makni la nami b'milsa de tzricha la, b'milsa de lo tzricha la lo makna. But say it could even be in a case where he's being makna her the animal. When is he makna her the animal? For a situation in which she needs it for a karban. Rabbi say in this case over here, does she need a karban? The answer is no. Why not? Because halacha l'maaseh he was made for the neder. Okay, so that's kavayt. So I'll say so now we've squared away. So just aside, I will say it's always interesting, by the way, to kind of keep track. Because part of the exciting thing of learning Shas is, you're doing a sugya, and the sugya will bring in what appears like another. It's a related nugget, but it's just such a fascinating idea. So here we see we're just exposed to this new idea. Does a husband have an obligation to provide his wife's karbanos over the course of their marriage? I will say, by the way, that's a big thing. That's a really big thing. Because what's the thing about it, just more, we're not accustomed to this. I often think about this. One of the things, I think about Mashiach a lot, but one of the things that is going to be so interesting when Mashiach comes, I will say, is whether we recognize it or not, often we do things that would generate a carbon chatos. Right? So I will say, a person flicks a light switch on Shabbos. Okay, without getting into it, right? Electricity, electricity, b'pashtos, that generates a carbon chatos. Right? So I will say, I think a lot of the things that we do accidentally, I'm talking about over here, right? Accidentally, when the Beis Hamikdash is here, that's carbonic liability. Which I will say, by the way, you see, what's the godless of a Beis Hamikdash? When you know that you have carbonic liability, I will say, you know what happens? What happens? So vigilant, right? So I will say, right? Can you imagine if you know that flicker of the light switch is $632? I'll say, I guarantee you, there's no accidental light switches. It's incredible, right? But if you think about it, that is the beauty of the Beis Hamikdash is not simply that it's a beautiful place to go, and it's such a really important. The Beis Hamikdash changes the way you think. The Beis Hamikdash changes the way you approach life. The Beis Hamikdash changes the way you behave. It changes everything because now suddenly there's a heightened sense of awareness. So therefore, the question of whether or not the husband is responsible for his wife's carbonic liability, it's a pretty big thing. It's a pretty big thing. So fundamentally, Rabbi Yehuda says, yes, he is. Rabbanan say, no, he's not. But bottom line, Rabbi said, what we have is, case number one of the Mishnah is now locked in. So Rachel says, Harini Nazira, separates out her karbanos from his animals. Reuven hears about it. He says he's made for it. What's talacha? Animals go back to the flock. Total chulin. And now we've established everyone agrees with that. Next case. So the Gemara says, Im shalah ha'isa behemta chatas tamas v'olatik. So we'll see now. Second case in the Mishnah was same case. Rachel says, I am a Nazira. Then what happens? She separates out animals. But whose animals? Whose animals? Her animals. So she separates out from her own animals. Achatas, an asham, and an ola. Sorry, achatas, a shlamim, and an ola, not asham. Achatas, shlamim, and an ola. So now we'll say, so now what happens? So now the Mishnah said, and now same thing. Reuven hears about the neder. He's made for the neder. So we'll say, so what has to happen? The chatas is left to die. Shlamim is offered up as an adava. And ola is offered up as an adava. So it says the Gemara, he minala. I'll say, by the way, from where does Rachel have her own animals? After all, we learned ha'amrit masha kansi isha kanabayla. What's the general principle that whatever a woman acquires, her husband acquires. So how does she have independently owned animals? Amra Papa, Shemikamtsasa meisasa. So I will say this is very interesting. Now, what does this mean? So I will say a woman receives a certain amount of mazonos, right? And a mazonos allotment. So what did Rachel do? Rachel is a very, what's the word? Frugal, right? Frugal lady. So what does she do? She doesn't use up all of her mazonos. So instead, whatever she uses, she sells off the rest. So she's establishing for herself a little bit of a side account, right? And from her side account is what she goes ahead and uses to purchase all of her animals. Another possibility: someone gave her property, right? And I will say, now this is actually interesting. So a person could give a married woman property and say to her, "This is yours with what? On the condition that your husband has no rights in this." And such a gift actually works. Okay, so whatever the mitzias is, I will say, whatever the mitzias is, halacha l'maisa, we can establish a case where she has independently owned. I will say, by the way, there's also another way she could do it, which is how? Right? So dowry, right? The problem, why doesn't the Gemara give that answer? Because remember again, with dowry, as much as she owns title, she doesn't have usufruct, right? Is that the legal term? Right? She doesn't have usage, right? She doesn't have payros. So what's interesting is she owns title, but she would not have the right to designate those animals as karbanos because her husband has usage. So that's why, again, you can, I always say, the notion of a woman owning something independent of her husband is not a chiddush at all, right? There's many cases you could construct. What we're looking to see is a case where she not only has title, but has the ability to actually designate it as a karban. So, okay, one of two possibilities. Either possibility A is halacha l'maisa, right? She was frugal and she had a side account, used money that was given to her to buy something, or halacha l'maisa, somebody gave it to her on the condition that her husband has no rights. Ha'ola tikrav ola, v'ashlamim tikrav. So now again, what's the halacha in that case? The chatos animal left to die. The ola offered up as an adava. Shlamim offered up as an adava. So Shmuel said to Avu bar Ihi, listen to this. Lo teisiv al karech, do not sit down. Ad the amris li hada milsa. Explain to me the following case. Now, I will say, now if you remember again, the Mishnah said, in all of these cases, so I'll say, let's play out this case, right? So Rachel Sararini Nazira, she separated out her own animals for a chatas, for an ola, for a shlamim. What happens? Husband now is made for the neder. What's the halacha? Chatas, tamus. Left to die. Ola, offered up as an adava. Shlamim, offered up as a adava. What did the Mishnah say? But she does not bring the loaves which normally accompany the karban of a Nazir. So now, Shmuel said to Avu bar Ihi, don't sit down until you explain to me the following thing. Let's explain to me the following thing. So I will say this idea of karbanos that don't require lechem. Tell me about the cases of karbanos that do not require accompanying bread offerings. Ve'eluhein, arba. Right? Arba ilim she'en tunan lechem. I will say there are four karbanos, literally four rams, that do not require lechem. Shalo v'shalah, the case of his, the case of hers. Shala achar misa, the case of after death. Ushala achar kapara, and the case ultimately again of after kapara. Now I will say these are four cases. We're going to focus on the first two of them. Shalah hada amran. So I will say the case of Shalah is the one we just said. What's the case of Shalah? That's the second case in our Mishnah, where she separated out her own animals, then the husband was made for the neder. The halacha is, Tchatas dies, Ola is offered up as an adava, Shlamim's offered up as an adava, but without any accompanying loaves. What's the case of Shalo? This nan ha'ish madres beno benazir. Shabbos said, this is a very interesting case. A father can make his son, this is obviously talking about a son who is a katan, can make his son a Nazir. Can make his son a Nazir. We're going to see this sugya. Where's this sugya? We're going to see this. Oh, Chavchas. Okay, in a couple of days from now. So we'll say, so a father can make his son a Nazir. Ve'ein ha'isha madaris espinan v'Nazir. But a mother cannot make her son a Nazir. Okay, so we'll say, now watch this. Gilach. What happens if the son, as a sign of protest, cuts his hair? There's a katan son. He decides, right? Now it's the act of rebellion. The kid doesn't want to be a Nazir, right? So what does he do? He cuts his hair. O shegilchu krovim. Shabbos is interesting. Or relatives step into this. It's fascinating. Relatives step in. They're unhappy that the father made the son a Nazir. So the relatives give the kid a haircut. Or micha, or the son objects. He says, Dad, I don't want to be a Nazir. Oh, shemichu krovim, or the relatives object. So I will say in all of these cases, essentially what that does is it annuls the neder nazir. So again, we're going to see the mechanics of this case. But instead, what you have over here is a father being madir his son as a nazir. And then what happens? If either the son objects, the father, or the relatives object, or the son gives himself a haircut, or the relatives give him a haircut, ultimately, again, that brings to a close the neder nazir. It's pretty interesting. The Gemara says, "Hayula mos." So we'll say, now what happens? What happens if in the interim, right after the father made his son nazir, the father went ahead and dedicated, right, or set aside money for the concluding karbanos of nazirus? So what do you do? In this case, he didn't separate out animals. In this case, he set aside money. So what do? Stumin yiplu nadava. If the money is not earmarked, so it's just a pile of money, then what? Now we'll say they all just go towards karban nadava. Nadava finally says the shmos mefurashin. However, we'll say again, if the money was explicitly earmarked, then the mechatas yechol yamamelach, the money set aside for a chata should be thrown into the yamamelach. Deme ola yaviu ola. Money for ola should be used to bring in ola nedava umolin bahen, and that money is subject to meila. Deme shlamim money yaviu shlamim should ultimately again be used to bring shlamim. V'nechol yom echad, and ultimately again I'll say all these karbanos can be consumed for one day. Ve'enon tu'unin lechem, and ultimately again they do not bring loaves of bread. So I'll say this is the case of shalom. This is the case of Shalom. So I'll say, remember again, just to frame this over here. Shmuel said to Avua bar Ihi, don't sit down until you tell me the cases of karbanos that are associated with Nazirus, but still the accompanying loaves are not brought. So now there are 4 cases. We've just gone through the first 2. Case 1 is Shalom. What's the case of Shalom? I'm sorry, the first case is Shalom. That's case number 2 in the Mishnah. That's case number 2 in the Mishnah, I will say, right? Which we just saw before. She goes ahead, Harim Nazira, separates out karbanos, husband is made for the neder, chatas dies, ola's offered up as an adava, shlom's offered up as an adava, no accompanying loaves. What's second case? Shalom. What's that case? That's the case of a father, ultimately who makes his son a nazir, then separated out money for karbanos, let's say specified the money, right? Chatas, ola, shlamim, then the son objects, relatives object, the son takes a haircut, relatives, so there's no more nazirus, the karbanos are offered up, but without the accompanying laws. We'll stop over here for today. We'll pick up at Mirat Hashem with the last 2 cases Mirat Hashem tomorrow. Both say, Shkoyach. All right, Chevron Zoom, have a great day, everyone. Good to see everyone.